Madam Speaker, coming from a country where women are treated not as individuals worth something on their own, but as rather a spoke in the overall family wheel, as if they're intended to serve that family and serve the institution of monogamy, and their worth being determined on that basis, we stand proudly to support this motion. What do we support? We support doing away with the entire institution of marriage and the fetishization of monogamy as a whole, right? So we think just like people are free currently to choose circles of friends, you should be free to choose circles of sexual partners. It doesn't matter whether you switch from one monogamous relationship to another, whether you have a series of one-night stands or a series of threesomes or foursomes or whatever. We don't think fetishizing that the ultimate ideal of a woman should be the ability to fit into a monogamous marriage. The ability to fit into a monogamous marriage and making that work is the societal norm that we are intending to break down. So I talk about three things, right? One, how did the patriarchal notion of marriage originate and what harms it confers on the women? Secondly, why is it bad for women to not be able to opt out of such monogamous relationships in such societies? And thirdly, the benefits of sexual liberation that this will bring about. So firstly, on the origin of marriage and creation of gender roles, right? We think it's quite simple. Division of labor such that women were assigned particular kinds of childbearing roles and men being physically superior were sent out as the gatherer and the hunter and the gatherer, right? That led to the creation of monogamous institutions where men could be secure that their women will be taking care of the children and the family as a whole will be secure, and and there will be a fostering of the future generation. Why is this problematic? Because as time progressed, right, the patriarchy manages to entrench this in terms of gender roles. Because it's advantageous to more powerful men for women to perform certain roles, that starts to define their worth in society. So your ability to be a good mother, for example, your ability to be a good wife, for example, your ability to be a good caregiver and maintain stability and peace in the household become what determines your worth, and any kind of dissent is cracked down upon quite heavily in terms of societal censure, in terms of your parents telling you to just suck it up and stick in that kind of marriage. See, what this means is, right, we think given that the rhetoric currently exists that you should stick together as one man and one woman because that is the institution that's best for childbearing and women are best suited for childbearing, your worth is now determined in that structure. Why is this problematic? Because people are unable to opt out. Let's first look at the facts. Correlation wise, the countries which are most sexually liberated, the countries with the highest divorce rates, such as the United States of America, also happen to be the ones which are best performing in terms of gender emancipation, in terms of women taking up to the workplace, in terms of having their individual identities, and in terms of not having to walk out on the streets with every single man leching at them or being in constant danger of sexual assault, etc. We think this correlation indicates that women are in general empowered when they can opt out of this patriarchal construction of monogamous relationships. Why is that? Yes.
Do you think a gender-emancipated role cannot have heterosexuality as a dominant social norm?
Let it have heterosexuality as a dominant social norm. Let it have all sexualities on an equal platform. I don't see how that's particularly relevant. I will, however, explain how this leads to it leads to emancipation of gay rights as well once you take this first step towards breaking down the monogamy as an institution, right? So why is it that this correlation actually makes sense? Firstly, because your worth is no longer going to be measured in terms of your ability to make the household work. At the point at which the monogamous relationship is not fetishized, women will no longer be required to serve that structure. What this means is, when you're growing up, your parents won't raise their girl children to be the ideal wife, to be someone who can listen to their in-laws. There won't be differentials in terms of male and female children are raised in countries like India, Pakistan, and other such patriarchal countries, right? Why is this a problem? Because when women are currently raised in order to serve the patriarchy and the monogamy, they psychologically determine themselves to be suited for those specific kinds of roles. They don't visualize themselves as having an academic or economic future of their own, which means they don't focus sufficiently on academics. Parents don't fund that education as much because the only thing that women need to learn is to how to serve this particular structure. Why is this bad? What's the comparative? One, in terms of in a world where you're no longer training your girl child to grow up to serve the monogamous marriage, you will instead train her to make responsible sexual choices and learn her own sexuality by exploration, right? Yeah. At the point at which you realize that my child will not be stuck in one marriage, but will have a multitude of sexual partners, you're better off encouraging her to understand what form of sexuality suits her well. Encourage sex education, encourage contraception, etc., and encourage safety in such kinds of relationships. Because now, as a parent, your psychology has changed in terms of believing this is what's best for my child. Therefore, that's how I shall I'll raise her. Secondly, what this means is, you will encourage women to be more independent. At the point at which you know that your girl child will have multiple sexual partners and not a stable relationship where she's economically and financially dependent on a man, as is the case in most of these monogamous marriages in like the third world nations or the patriarchy, you would then encourage her to become financially stable, to get a job, to earn money so that she can move on from one relationship or one sexual encounter to the other. Thirdly, this would lead to a reduction of abusive marriages. Currently, women are forced to remain in such marriages where their husbands are either beating them or psychologically abusing them on a daily basis because either they don't have the money or the means to make it work outside of the marriage, or two, because society as a whole will castigate them the moment they choose to opt out, because then you have failed in the one role that was assigned to you in that society to serve that monogamous institution, right? Which is really harmful, because these are the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate who have absolutely no opt out. The only way to actually emancipate them is to break down the fetishization of the institution as a whole. Say, let's say what this will not be about. I think children will still probably be raised pretty well, and it will actually like not be coercive labor. It's problematic that housewives around the world are not paid for their labor. In our world, there will be no housewives. You will hire nannies who have actually chosen to do the same work, and therefore there are greater numbers of women who are emancipated. Finally, on sexual liberation, right? Fourth thing, one, virginity won't be fetishized in the same manner. Because if you're not meant for one man, you don't need to remain a virgin, and there won't be honor killings on that basis once it's found out that there will be sex. Secondly, you won't grow up with like repressed religious psychology which claims hegemony of sexual ethics and what's appropriate for a woman to do and what's not appropriate for a woman to do. What kinds of clothes are okay to wear because your in-laws might not be okay with it, right? All of these are better because women grew up in a more healthy environment where they can choose what's best for them rather than be told on a daily basis that it's either this or you're not good enough. And thirdly, this leads to emancipation of other kinds of sexuality, right? At the point at which you don't care about marriages being between one man and one woman, and everyone can choose their own sexual partners, it prepares society for a scenario where gay sex is far more acceptable, right? Because at the point at which you break down marriage, all of these religious fundamentalists who say homosexuality breaks the fundamentals of marriage will no longer have that argument at their disposal. We beg to propose. I'm back in form, bitch. Thank you so much.
Okay, I thank the member for his address, and I invite the leader of the opposition.
Madam Speaker, all aspects of society have facets that need to be reformed in order to achieve gender emancipation. The question in this debate round is not whether or not there are problems with monogamy as it's instantiated in either Western liberal democracies or more conservative countries, but whether or not there are things that are not merely incidental but inherent to monogamous structures that make it the case that it is going to be bad for individuals of formerly disadvantaged gender roles. I think what the side government fails to do in this round is argue why monogamy is inherently oppressive, and instead talk about why the patriarchy is instantiated in monogamy. But, Madam Speaker, we recognize that the patriarchy is instantiated in every societal institution as it exists today. And the world we should be comparing is not a liberal utopia or the world that we currently exist in, but two very liberal worlds that are both experiencing very liberal formats of gender emancipation. And the difference is in one world, we see that monogamy exists as a dominant social norm. In the other world, it doesn't. And evaluate which of these two worlds is really capable of full gender emancipation. We are not comparing India or the United States or any country that exists right now to a world in which doesn't exist with marriage, but an ideal gender emancipated world in both sides of the house where either monogamy exists or it doesn't. In this comparison, we think it is quite clear. You do not need the elimination of monogamy to experience full gender emancipation. And in fact, monogamy has benefits not just to women, but to society writ large at promoting their interests and protecting them from forms of oppression. No, thank you. So what do we think we really should be analyzing in this debate round? I'm going to bring you a few arguments of our independent evaluation. The first thing I want to talk about is why monogamy has objective value, especially to individuals of formerly disadvantaged gender roles. Because we think that in some ways, no thank you, society is the case. It's not just because of society, but because of simple biology, that there are differences in the burdens that are placed on individuals in relationships. It is not the case that the burden of an unwanted pregnancy falls equally on men and women. And I think that we need to recognize that in our society and understand that commitment benefits not individuals just of both genders, but especially the individuals where the burdens fall most heavily on for the unexpected and for the malicious consequences of these kinds of actions. So what we think we get by increasing commitment in society because people are committed to their sexual partners is these benefits. They say that commitment is going to lead to serious problems because men are going to beat their wives if they feel they're not being committed. We think this is a purely incidental problem that exists within these societies and not something that is inherent to monogamy. We can envision monogamous societies where men don't beat their wives, and I think given that this is the case, it is clearly incidental and not an inherent problem. But secondly, I think monogamy brings subjective value to people. It is not just that they are objectively better off when they have the ability to access commitment, but that people value it. I think people often value a lot of social norms. And if that social norm has pernicious consequences for people, we think that it might be a reason to get rid of it. But again, what they needed to show us was that these pernicious consequences are, again, inherent to monogamy, as opposed to incidental in how it's instantiated in a patriarchal society. Go ahead.
This debate is about a realistic situation and the process you undertake to reach emancipation rather than an ideal utopia in which people are emancipated whether or not you want
to read the motion. It wasn't abolish marriage, and I think that that's what they're going to try to stake their hat on and make this debate round about. They're missing exactly what this debate was supposed to be about. And I think that what they need to do in this round is actually engage with that kind of analysis about the inherent capacities of monogamy and not how it exists in the world today, because we're debating about the achievement of full gender emancipation, not like a small marginal impact or even from a large marginal impact from the society in which we live today. But the next thing I want to talk about is why monogamy reduces objectification. Because I think what they fail to understand on their side of the house is that social norms don't disappear. There is no society in the world that has no social norms regarding what is an acceptable sexual practice. And I think that if you try to eliminate monogamy or monogamy disappears as an acceptable social practice, other ones will rise up to take its place. This debate round has to be comparative, not just between monogamy and its absence, but monogamy and alternative social structures that would rise up in its place. We think that the only ones, essentially, that they've discussed in this round, and the only ones that are reasonable, are ones where there are essentially polygamous societies where people can engage with this kind of things. We think that serial monogamy is essentially a form of debate that we engage with on our side of the house. Serial monogamy exists in many societies that allow, for example, both marriage and divorce with very easy ways. For example, like a no-fault divorce, like often in some jurisdictions in the United States, is a totally acceptable form of monogamy and has many of the benefits that we've already discussed. So the real comparison is between societies that are polygamous, polyandrous, or polygynous, and the societies that we live in that have monogamy on our side of the house. But before I move on, I'll take your point.
Monogamy eventually forces individuals, if they want to have a lasting intimate relationship, to focus all that intimacy into one person. How does that change the calculus of how people view their intimacy in relation to other individuals?
I think they view it as something that's really important to them. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's like, I don't understand why that's harm. Like, yes, intimacy is an important part of a monogamous relationship. That's our argument about commitment. It's good that people value intimacy with other people, and that has no effect whatsoever on women or men specifically. In fact, we think it has perverse effects when you eliminate the benefits of intimacy and the importance of intimacy in relationships, because then they become about something else, which is sort of the part I was talking about with the alternative structures. These alternative structures encourage objectification, which we think occurs when intimacy isn't valued, and what instead is valued is essentially using someone as a sexual object for one's own pleasure without valuing commitment or seeing them as a human being with their own independent worth. We think that in societies where, for example, you see polygamy or polyandry, what instead occurs is people try to appeal or compete within the relationships to be each other's person's primary sexual partner, which we think has really pernicious consequences when you see this kind of conflict between individuals in this kind of relationship, undermining intimacy, increasing objectification by increasing the incentives to try to make yourself appear as sexy or beautiful and making that a more important aspect of the society, which we think is really problematic. I think this makes it quite clear why none of these problems are inherent, but I actually want to discuss some of the affirmative argumentation that they've given you and make it quite clear why they're problematic. They first identify monogamy as a purely social institution that exists because of the patriarchy. I think this is false. Swans don't have a patriarchy, they are monogamous. It is a biological effect, and I don't think it's the case that monogamy is a purely patriarchal force. It exists in other species, and I think it makes it quite clear that it is not purely cultural. But I also think that it's not just between one man and one woman either. You can have a monogamous culture where the relationships are no serial and between individuals of different gender identities. I don't think we're defending a version of traditional marriage on our side of the house, and I don't think that is what monogamy could be in the world that we're discussing, which is a world of full gender emancipation. They also then argue a correlation effect, that societies that are more liberal with their sexual practices often have to be more liberal broadly. That doesn't mean that having this particular change in these societies is going to all of a sudden make them liberal. I think the problem that they fail to recognize is that the patriarchy would be able to use alternative structures in more pernicious ways, like I talked about under my arguments on our affirmative case. Then they essentially say is what it causes people to do is teach their children that what they need to do in their life is to be a good wife. Again, I think this is an incidental and not an inherent problem regarding monogamy. The problem in this case is not that monogamy exists, but that people are told that their purpose in life is monogamy, and that their purpose in life is to be someone else's spouse, as opposed to valuing relationships in this particular form. So I don't think that this is an inherent issue with monogamy either. Then they essentially make these arguments about how it leads to violence between individuals as a result of sexual practices, like, for example, honor killings of individuals who are virgins. And again, I don't think this is an inherent problem of monogamy. Monogamy is not having no sex before marriage. It is that what we think you have is sexual relationships that involve a great deal of commitment, even if that commitment isn't a marriage commitment. And I don't think that it is a problem with an inherent problem with monogamy. What they needed to do in this debate round is not just talk about monogamy as it exists in our world, but how it might exist in a world with full gender emancipation. And until they do that, they cannot win this round.
I thank the members for the address, and I invite the deputy to the floor.
What the fetishization of monogamy over history and in the present day has done to our world is that it's conflated the reproductive function with the sexual function. So when I get to my substantive argument, I'm going to first talk about how this essentializes women, how monogamy essentializes women to their reproductive function and creates a collective identity around womanhood on that basis. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this entrenches taboos about sexual characteristics. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why monogamy is very heteronormative and very cisnormative, and how there are other gender groups that we need to talk about as well. Right? Before that, very quickly rebuttal. Soradeep's reason for giving you a statistical correlation, right? Like what he said was, it ought to be relevant to this debate, Madam Speaker, that the countries in the world that have the highest rates of marital rape and the highest rates of domestic violence also have the lowest rates of divorce should tell you a lot about marriage, right? What we're saying on government bench today is that we will not let opposition get away with saying, oh, as the patriarchy gets looser and as the world gets less misogynist, then marriage will be fine, it will be less harmful. We agree that marriage will be less harmful in a less sexist world. We also think it will be less relevant, right? As like the more and more women get the right and the more and more you have women with financial independence, with the right to divorce, with a social structure that allows them to not be called sluts after their divorce, more and more women are getting divorced, Madam Speaker. And that should tell you that marriage is in fact a patriarchal prison. It always has been. If the prison gets looser and nicer and better, it just gets easier to escape. And that's exactly what's happening. We are very, very sorry for placing this debate in the real world and not some hypothetical in which we're presuming gender emancipation and then comparing monogamy and things like that. The next thing he came out and said is that there are alternatives to monogamy. Our alternative was quite simple, right? A scenario in which, in the same way we have male friends and female friends, and in the same way that we have some close friends and some peripheral friends, we can have male sexual partners, female sexual partners, transsexual partners, close sexual partners, peripheral sexual partners. We don't necessarily need to be like entrenched or like confined to some Islamic sort of polygamous relationship that like leader of opposition tried to force us to defend. We're having none of that. Then he comes out and says, patriarchy will do other things to oppress women, at least they can't do this thing, whatever. Then he comes out and says, swans are monogamous. All right, but the difference between human beings and swans is that like there is a recreational sexual aspect to the sex that we have, and that's very, very different from like biologically wanting to reproduce. But also, by the way, like lions are not monogamous, so ridiculous, right? But let's talk about why this essentializes women to their reproductive function and creates a collective identity around womanhood, right? Because here's the thing, we think it's completely arbitrary, Madam Speaker, that 2 is the number of people that is appropriate for a sexual relationship. The only reason that it exists is because one man and one woman are what it requires to produce one child, right? So the reason monogamy has been fetishized is because it produces children, right? I'm going to get to why this is heteronormative and cisnormative later, but why does this harm women? Because it means that the only reason you are a woman ought to get into a sexual relationship is so that she can have a child. And like we see that as extremely problematic when like women in places like India are valued only by what their husband does or what their child does, right? Behind every successful man is like a woman who supports him. We see that as very, very true of the narrative between Barack and Michelle Obama of all people, which we find ridiculous, right? But it essentializes women to the reproductive function, and this imposes a collective identity upon them, right? What does this mean? What this means is that any action a woman does, she is always viewed as acting as a representative of her gender, right? So, for example, when Sauradeep Sen does something, he's not scrutinized as in, oh, are you doing something that benefits your gender or not? But when Julia Gillard or Miley Cyrus or Sheryl Sandberg does something, one of the first few questions asked is, oh, what sort of impact does this have as far as her gender is concerned? We don't think this is good, right? We think these people need to be given respect as individuals taking decisions on their own and not like always essentialized as representatives of their gender. But here's the problem. Men are only representatives of their gender when they are oppressing women. What does this mean? This means, Madam Speaker, that for example, the fact that sexual violence, right, like rape or sexual assault, is like a hate crime in our society, is like an expression of patriarchal contempt. It stems from the fact that there is a collective identity around womanhood, right? Like a hate crime can only happen when there is a certain collective identity. So we think creating a collective identity around womanhood empowers the rapist in expressing his patriarchal contempt against all women when he rapes one woman. And we think that's extremely problematic, right? We want to do away with this collective identity around womanhood. And we think like doing away with monogamy is one of the many things that started this whole process of collectivization. We want to end it, right? Let's talk about how this entrenches taboos about sexual characteristics, right? As a sex-positive feminist, nothing irks me more than viewing sexuality as a peculiar or unique human characteristic, any different from like other things like your athletic ability or your artistic ability or your like ability to make people laugh. Okay, quickly.
Why is it the case that non-heterosexual persons form monogamous relationships? Isn't it clearly the case that there are other values besides just the reproductive function that are facilitated by monogamy?
No, I was going to get to how in a heteronormative world we've made gay people think that that's what's right for them, but I'll get to that later, right? But yeah, how this entrenches taboos about sexual characteristics, right? And Sauradeep spoke about this, right? Creating sexuality as the one distinct characteristic of human identity is exactly what is used to oppress women when it comes to things like virginity and create like a sort of like, this is the sort of woman you need to be a virgin and don't be a slut, while the macho man gets to be this guy who's planting his seed everywhere, right? We think that's extremely oppressive, even in the absence of like everything else they said. But why is this heteronormative and cisnormative? I already told you, right? Like because 2 is an extremely arbitrary number for any like sexual relationship. We think why is it important for like gay people or for trans people who have nothing to do with sexual reproduction being in monogamous relationships? That's entirely cultured, right? Like we think, for example, in the same way that many of us can debate together, many of us can fuck together, and hopefully we'll reach a world where that's possible. We are proud to propose.
Okay, I'd like to member for his address, and I invite the deputy leader of the opposition forward to close out the front half of your hearing.
Hard to follow that line. So, Madam Speaker, I think that they've done a good job of showing why, in a society where there are prevalent sexist attitudes that are deeply entrenched, people might be able to use the institution of monogamy as a manifestation of those attitudes. But I think that the way that the debate is supposed to play out, or the interesting debate that we're having is, in a world where we have sort of this, this gender emancipation, is monogamy itself the tipping point for full gender emancipation. So I think that on our side of the house, we're going to prove why there's nothing inherent to monogamy that increases these sexist attitudes, and in fact, that there is some value to women for being in monogamous relationships. And I actually want to start, so I'm going to go through a couple things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the value that monogamy has, both in the objective sense and subjective sense. And then I'm going to talk about sort of like why we think it will shift the focus in a very negative way when monogamy doesn't exist. But the first thing I want to do is sort of start where they ended their speech, which was the fact that it's cultured and they talk about like, you know, how it's like very cisgender normed and like heteronormative. So I just don't think it's the case that the only reason that people enter into monogamous relationships is because there's this cultural norm. I think that, in fact, you look at people who are not interested in having kids, you look at people who biologically can't have kids together, being in happy monogamous relationships all the time. And the reason isn't just because there's this oppressive cultural norm that forces them to be in a monogamous relationship, but sometimes you can just be happy being in a monogamous relationship. Intimacy isn't a bad thing. You can be both sex positive, you can be a feminist, and also be in a monogamous relationship. And I think the rhetoric that they're giving you is they're actually creating their own social norm. They're saying it's bad to have this choice. And I think that fundamental to anything that they need, because I mean, if you buy all of their arguments about why monogamy is so bad, they are like creating their own norm, which we think can be just as harmful. Because the core of the issue, we think, is this choice. Like serial monogamy is still monogamy on our side of the house. So let's look at the value that we think that monogamy can have.
Yes, sir.
They said that, actually before I go on, I'll take you down.
Yeah. This debate, we are fine in a world where monogamy is not considered morally superior for people to still opt into it. This debate is about whether that cultural norm should exist to begin with.
No, the debate is like whether it should be the end of monogamy, right? Like whether, and we're giving you reasons why it might be okay for monogamy to be a prevalent social norm. So, and I think we've been very clear about that. So let's look at the value of monogamy and why it can be useful. So the first thing they talk about is like why we need to sort of get away from the focus between monogamy and reproduction. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So yes, monogamy does not always need to be related to reproduction, and in a lot of ways it isn't. But I also think that you can't ignore the realities of reproduction, or you can't ignore the biological realities of the difference in burdens that men and women share. And I don't think they ever really address this argument that Zach gives you in the opening speech, which is, because women bear most of the biological cost of pregnancy, sometimes it is useful to have someone who is in a committed relationship to help share that burden. That is a value that monogamy gives, and yes, it is just a biological reality that needs to be confronted. So that can be the type of value that we get, and it allows for more shared burdens on our side of the house, right? Like a woman by herself, like not saying that like definitely can't be done, or like clearly that's not the case, but it's just a better off on our side of the house when you have that support structure, and I think that's the argument that they need to confront. But the second and the more subjective value is something I'll talk about a little bit, but like people value things like intimacy. People value the fact that when they are in a relationship with another person, that they are going to get some sort of happiness and utility from being in that relationship, and we're okay, I'll get you in a second, and we're okay with allowing that choice and allowing that norm to exist.
Does the fact that some people can enjoy having an unequal status make that status any less unequal?
No, so that requires, like, in order for that POI to like, it like requires you to win all of the other arguments about the unequal status. We're just providing why monogamy can be good. Because remember, the burden is on their side of the house to show why in a society where, again, full gender emancipation is taking place, why ending monogamy would be the tipping point between like partial gender emancipation and full gender emancipation, which I think was very clear both from the motion and also the way the debate's gone. So at that point in time, we think that there is some sort of value. But here's the other, there's some sort of value. So the next thing I want to talk about is why we think that this actually shifts the focus in a really pernicious way when it comes, shifts the focus in a really pernicious way in terms of like what society focuses on and what society values. So we think that when you go from society where monogamy might be a norm, you then shift the focus to like having these like sort of different sexual partners in different relationships. So why can this be really bad? So first of all, we think that this actually increases the amount of objectification that occurs. Again, this is another argument that Zach gave you that I don't think would have responded, but I want to expand upon it a little bit. We think that when you are in a relationship and you see
that
like
points up.
future value in that relationship, you're more likely to focus on things that aren't just the appearance. You're more likely to care about like things that go deeper than just like the appearance of the person or first impressions, etc. So you're more likely to get the intimacy that we think actually might be a positive thing. When you're talking about this sort of like finding different partners, it creates this like competitive aspect that has a lot of pernicious societal norms. I think we see this manifestation all the time in society today. So the fact that when you focus more on appearance, there's a big manifestation of sexist attitudes because people believe that they have to like there's this attitude that like women have to like impress men, or that there's this competition between women to like find the best male sexual partner. These types of attitudes, I think, are actually inherent in a societal structure where monogamy isn't a social norm. So we think that's the type of bad competition that you get. So in a society like they're talking about, where there's all these bad things that are happening from monogamy, if there's so many sexist attitudes already in that society, we think that's going to transfer over in a more pernicious way when it comes to a society where there's a lot of different, where people are looking for a lot of different partners. So at that point in time, you get all of the bad things, except you're not having the support structure, you're not having the incentive structure to have a relationship in which you are valuing that person in the future. When I am in a monogamous relationship, I have an incentive to like, because I'm going to be around that person all the time, to have like a happier relationship in the future, which sort of deters me from taking all these bad actions. That incentive structure doesn't exist on their side of the house when you don't have that type of future value. So look, I think that we've shown you that there's something inherent about monogamy that actually increases sexist attitudes. They've just shown that monogamy can be used as an institution, as a manifestation of sexist attitudes that already exist. We're very trying to propose.
Address, and I invite the extended speaker forward to open the back half. I'd like to remind everyone we should use our inside voices when we're talking to our partners. We're in a small room, etc. You all know that ish. Anyways, without any further ado.
While the opposition may be somewhat right that certain types of norms that exist within our society are not tied to monogamous relationship, they cannot completely divorce themselves from the idea that some type of stereotypes, some kind of socializations, some type of individual of society's judgments upon people are going to exist. That's where I think the opening opposition fell into the biggest trap. Because what they end up failing to prove to you is how a dominant monogamous relationship, where individuals are judging polyamorous relationships, where people are still prying into your relationships and not realize they are okay with it. It's not okay. It actually stops individuals from fully maximizing their happiness. Particularly, we think it's women who have the major burden of having to take care of the child when the men doesn't. This is unfortunately a biological burden that plays upon them. But we think in the long term, as long as women don't have complete sexual freedom in terms of how long they can have their monogamous relationships, it's okay. Because looking at that their side is okay with women having multiple sexual partners, but then eventually narrowing down to one type of relationship with one person. What they end up conceding that POI when they say that intimacy is being valued is that in a monogamous relationship, in a one-to-one person, society puts matches together. Society likes to say X person is good with Y individual, which means that individually it essentializes you to be representative of good of one thing. It essentializes you that one thing part of you is important, is powerful. In the current world, it's women's sexuality. In their world, it's intimacy. We're not okay with essentializing any single matching partners into one part of the relationship where society still makes a dominant judgment of X or Y. For instance, there's a guy and there's two men together in a monogamous relationship. Society will still have some type of stereotype within what type of partner this person should be versus another one. Recognize that's the purpose of monogamy. Like monogamy at the very beginning has been a way to separate types of family spheres or job workplaces. We think that's the inherent problem with monogamy, and that's where Julie and I stand our case today. That monogamy essentially dichotomizes the relationship within individuals of what they need to do. It makes intimacy only one thing that everything else that my partner doesn't do, I need to take care of. That's the oppression that occurs. Unfortunately, women have to bear more of that because of biology, but we also think these stereotypes exist, and they cannot completely divorce themselves from these stereotypes. We think Julius and I are going to take this debate. What am I going to talk about? I'm going to first talk about, realistically, inside today's world, whether for opening government, why monogamy inherently causes these types of stereotypes within there. I'm going to draw a lot more in mechanisms there. And secondly, I'm even going to paint you on the ground that they want to paint about why monogamy, even in this completely gender-realized world, is still inherently problematic. That's where Julius and I are going to be. We think we win both of these sides. First, how monogamy inside the current world develops relationships that are problematic. Recognize the way that history has worked. It means that the weaker perceived gender, whatever it is socializes into satisfy the dominant gender or the relationship which is supposed to lead the relationship that's supposed to make the decisions. What happens is, even if you have a co-partnership where people are equally making decisions, we don't think you can divorce yourselves from stereotypes of what people think about gay individuals or gay men or the way that gay men view. Even gay individuals still stereotype themselves when they have different categories like this person's more feminine versus this person's more masculine. We think the minute that you don't have a monogamous relationship, that takes that away. Because recognize that society itself makes traditional matches, which makes stereotypes exist. In a polyamorous relationship, what happens is you can divert those type of intimacies into particular you can change them into different separate groups. I like to try that word before. What that means is this, that if I'm in a relationship with Julius doesn't have to be antithesis and take care of my children the ways that I don't do it, but I can have multiple individuals who do that. For instance, Julius, if he's really good at a particular way, can take care of that. But I know Julius is bad at being a really, really warm person, so I might seek out another relationship and take care of that. What this means is that full gender equality cannot be reached unless what happens is we stop putting the burden of fully realizing that relationship onto just one individual. That's problematic. The opening opposition needed to deal with that. They did not.
Point.
Second, no. The other thing about monogamy is that it requires you to continuously stay in one relationship, or at least only seek out that type of relationship. That's the dominant idea. What does this lead to? They can't tell you that this doesn't lead to people being reluctant to divorce themselves. Like, that's inherently, psychologically part of it. Like, the dominant relationship says, I'm supposed to be satisfied by one person. Why am I not satisfied with this one person? Is there something wrong with me? This type of creeping doubt is the problem that leads to people being stuck inside relationships they don't want. This creeping doubt that you have to be in a one-on-one relationship is the problematic aspect that what happens is, when you have a monogamous relationship, it doesn't divorce that idea. This means that what happens is this leads to abuse of individuals. This leads to people being locked in relationships they don't want to, instead of seeking out other relationships. This means that the individual who's less mobile in society, whichever gender is being discriminated now with socioeconomically, does not have the same types of means to seek out these type of relationships. That's why today, women are being cheated on while men are getting away with it. Because that's just the way the picture exists. Whatever new stereotype takes into control, the same type of thing will manifest itself. I don't think the open relationship can win that argument. And so, on the second point, actually I'll take you.
If the benefit and value of polyamorous relationships is some sort of comparative advantage for the best child rearers raise the kids, how is it any different in terms of essentializing people for intimacy when you're now just essentializing them for their ability to rear a child?
So this is a comparative debate. Would I rather be essentialized into an entire, complete, opposite, antithetical role to the other type of the person's relationship? Or would I rather be able to pick and choose what type of essentialization I get to do? The one that makes me the most happiest, the one that I actually tie to my own identity. You need to deal with that comparative debate. Second thing about how we think we win in this weird world that the open opposition has been trying to contradictorily claim they can both exist in, but we don't think they can divorce themselves from. What happens is, what they cannot disagree with that monogamy leads to, is it leads to eventually believing that you have to find one type of relationship. That means that the other types of relationships that you had are a foolish thing, are things that you don't, really were just waste of your time, or getting you ready for this one person to be with you. That in of itself is the inherent nature of monogamy. Why is this oppressive? I asked them a POI, why is it okay to tie intimacy into one particular way and make it valued? What happens is, the way that tying intimacy to be really, really important in this world has essentialized women into protecting their sex. Opening government calls this protecting your virginity and making it valuable. But in a different world that they paint, by valuing the type of intimacy and only sharing it with one person, it necessarily says that the particular gender that has to give that intimacy is devaluing themselves when they give it to multiple individuals. That's why it's frowned down upon in a monogamous relationship, especially a dominant one, when you have a friend who you're much closer to and share your emotional parts with, but not your husband. That leads to creeping down, that leads to problems of individuals being able to actualize that relationship and actualize themselves. This is the inherent problem of monogamy. It essentially makes you have to value some part of yourself and say that you can only give to one person, which leads to such things as ownership of your body that the opposition is clearly against, but has completely manifested itself in our society. At least individuals saying that I can only give this particular thing to one person, and one person only is the one person I have to continue looking for. Gender equality cannot exist because of this particular valuing of one part of persons. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I thank the member for his address, and I invite the Senate speakers for opposition.
asked opening government at a point of information whether or not heterosexuality would be a dominant norm in their world, they said, probably, we want to put these on an equal playing field and let people choose. Crucially, that's exactly what we want to do with relationship structures. When these guys say a dominant social norm can simply be the thing that lots of people want to do, or indeed that the majority or a dominant proportion of people want to do, we agree. And that's the status of marriage that we envisage in our world. At no point do they explain why something being a norm means it must be a coercive norm, a norm that you feel bad if you don't buy into. That's the link they never explain to you. That's why they can't win this debate. Three things in this speech. I'm going to respond to everything we've heard on government bench. I'm going to talk to you about getting to this gender-emancipated world and why monogamy is actually a very important part of that. And finally, I'm going to talk about what this world would look like and why monogamy would necessarily be a big part of that, or indeed a dominant one. So, the case we get out of the government bench is consistently, monogamy means that gendered roles are amplified. One, as opening opposition pointed out, it's unclear if gendered roles are included within the conceit of this debate. But even if they are, it's not clear why they're amplified, right? So firstly, in a relationship in which the two parties are exclusively dependent upon one another for that sphere of their lives, it would appear that the less powerful party has a nuclear option, namely of ending that relationship. Contrast that with a relationship in which individuals are contingent upon a relationship with lots of different individuals, when no one individual has the capacity to hold the other one to account in that way. Crucially, this is something that only ever benefits the least powerful party. There's an equalization of power dynamics within relationships that comes from being exclusively dependent upon that other individual. We would suggest that this is more likely to benefit weaker people, which in your world would appear to be women. Secondly, however, we point out that their argument about roles diversifying within marriage is just a wash in this debate. Indeed, it's slightly worse. What they said is, at the point at which you have a greater degree of diversification within relationships, people are able to specialise in the roles that they take up within relationships. Yes, but what you don't explain is why those roles won't still be just gendered, right? All you seem to get is increased specialisation within gender paradigms. It's unclear how that's more liberating. Prima facie, it would appear to be less so. The final thing they say right at the end is, look, you get creeping doubt on our side, but look, your comparative in this debate, right, is informal or polyamorous relationships. You just get competing doubt on that side too. The difference is, it's within the relationship. Whereas on our side of the house, you get the security of knowing, I am married to that person, so although there is some degree of worry about the fact they might get with someone else, I am married to them and they have made that commitment to me. On your side, they have made a commitment to lots of people, so there's much more fluidity between the individuals and much more internal competition within that structure. We would suggest that because you don't have the comfort of that commitment, that's actually something that's considerably worse and that denigrates your well-being much more. So, why is it necessary to have monogamy on our side of the house to get to that gender-emancipated world? Because the contrasting relationships they give rely on two things. The first thing they say is they're going to be informal, i.e. hookups, and secondly, they're going to be to some degree polyamorous. I'm going to explain why, comparatively, both of those are worse in terms of getting to this gender-emancipated world. First off, informality. What we tell you is that an informal relationship gives you much less capacity for redistribution. Two reasons. First off, there's much less capacity for redistribution post facto, right, in the event that the relationship falls up. You can't have a divorce law at the point at which people are just engaging in hookups or informal relationships. Crucially, this is really important in terms of ensuring some degree of economic equalisation between various parties who engage in these sorts of relationships, right? Look at the way in which liberalisation of divorce laws in the United States has led to an unprecedented number of women having an unprecedented amount of capital, which they've been able to invest in an economy that's better tailored towards women, but also, crucially, in a political system to ensure that it serves women to a greater degree. Huge proportion of eminent donations come from divorcees. But thirdly, right, if you are concerned about women not being rewarded for the work that they do in gender roles, which they'll do on your side too, just in a more specialised manner, right? At the very least, by having a legal structure there, you enable that legalised redistribution. We would suggest that that's a comparative win for our side. Secondly, however, you get a greater degree of equalisation of power dynamics within relationships. Why is that true? Because an individual has the capacity, one individual has the capacity to terminate a relationship in the event of mistreatment. Crucially, that is an equal burden that the two individuals have, and something that women have disproportionately, therefore, if they are the weaker parties within that. We contrast that to a polyamorous relationship in which no individual has the capacity to end that relationship in that manner, and there is no expectation of stability or formality. In that way, men can simply shift from one relationship to another without ever being hurt by the fact that the woman or the weaker party has moved away from them on account of abuse. So it gives you that nuclear option which enables you to equalise power dynamics and crucially change the incentives of men when they're within that relationship. I'll take closing.
But at the same reciprocal side, women who are in unlikely relationship can also just flake out and go to other relationships that are much more satisfying. You can explain to me why
yeah. But look, we're not standing for coercion on our side of the house, and this is what you miss, right? We're not saying we want to live in a world in which people are coerced into marriage. We're simply saying we want to live in a world in which most people value it, right? There's a key distinction there. If they are not leaving the relationship, it is because they value the marriage, and that is theirs to value. I don't understand why you suggest they shouldn't, right? Finally, secondly, however, polyamorous relationships are also worse. Why is that true? Because in an environment of competing actors, the one who is most powerful has the greatest power, right, and is capable of getting the others to divide and rule. It's no coincidence that in the real world, the vast majority of polyamorous relationships are actually highly abusive. It's because men are able to use the fact they are considered more sexually desirable, more economically powerful, and often more socially capital to play women off against one another to satisfy them, right? That's an incredibly pernicious effect, because it means that, one, women are less able to band together at the point at which they're being marginalised because there are more of them and they have to mobilise together more. But secondly, because there's some degree of competition, there's actually a degree of rivalry, so it's much harder to get those women to come together. For examples, I refer you to Big Love. It's a great show. Finally, what we tell you is that in a world in which there is true gender emancipation and in which people are able to choose the relationships that they want, many would opt for marriage, right? Many would opt for a monogamous relationship. Indeed, a dominant proportion would, we posit. That means that in your world, if people are to be genuinely gender emancipated, marriage must be the dominant social norm, because it is the preference of most people, and your world allows people to realise their preferences, right? Thus, by contradiction, we show your case to be false. So what we tell you is most people want marriage. Now, opening our position explains to some degree by saying people want stability. But what we tell you in closing is that stability is a particular response to the human aging process and the slow decline that engenders. These guys say divorce happens less more in emancipated countries. That's true, but actually long-term marriage is better within these countries and lasts longer, right? More people die married in these countries than they do, say, in India, because the key point is people are able to preference their partners beforehand and select for the ones who are best suited to them. So what we tell you is that the aging process means that people's social capital, economic capital, and just desirability goes down hugely. In that environment of social exclusion, you want two things. One, given that you are going to be a less desirable sexual object, you want some commitment from your partner to ensure they're not going to leave you as you engage in that slow decline and deterioration. But secondly, in a world in which the rest of the world is leaving you behind, that notion of having someone upon whom you can rely, whom you can trust, who will have and hold you in sickness and health, and who will value you in that manner, is of special importance. So we say, within the context of the human aging process, as people get older and they need to be valued by someone, they will necessarily seek a commitment from an individual to secure that. That can't happen within a polyamorous structure, because individuals can simply flake away incrementally. So what we tell you on our side of the house is both that in getting there we need marriage, but also once we are there, monogamy will be an essential part of how people form relationships. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the member for his address, and I invite the government whip to close up the government.
What we say, stand firmly on our side of the house behind, is the idea that monogamy, permanence, the idea that you can only be with one person for the rest of your life, fundamentally prevents the achievement of gender emancipation by putting women in a weaker position vis-a-vis men through the marital structure and through the monogamy that's associated with that structure. I'll have 2 points of crystallization for you today, Mr. Speaker. First, what is exactly gender emancipation, and why do we do a better job of bringing it out outside government? And second, does monogamy necessarily prevent the achievement of that gender emancipation? But first, several points of rebuttal to the extension. The party speaker says that, well, the weaker party actually gets the benefit of monogamy because they have the so-called nuclear option. They can say, well, I can just pull out of the relationship and that you're going to have a great harm from that because of the monogamous norm, and therefore it actually puts women in a stronger position. But I think this is totally unrealistic. Imagine a circumstance in which a woman is pregnant, particularly in one of these third world countries where these norms are particularly strong. She can't simply say, oh, I'm going to pull out of this relationship. I'm going to enter a job market that discriminates against me because I'm a woman and because I am pregnant. Because of those norms in the society, Mr. Speaker, in fact, it is the woman who is stuck in that monogamous norm because they don't have the ability to access the job market, they don't have the ability to access independent forms of support. And we say that without the monogamous norm, parents would be more likely to teach their children that, well, you should actually have the skills, like a good education, to make sure that you never have to be dependent on a man for your financial status. And so we don't think this nuclear option, so-called, actually exists. We think that the monogamous norm prevents women from being able to get the independence of pulling out of a relationship. The second point he makes, Mr. Speaker, is that, well, people feel a lack of commitment without the monogamous norm. We feel that the fact that people feel a need for this type of commitment is a result of the monogamous norm in and of itself. And so, Mr. Speaker, we don't see any reason why people can't get commitment from more than one other person, or 2 or 3 feel the good. But furthermore, we don't see why that commitment necessarily has to be sexual. So for example, I can have a relationship with a number of partners, only some of which I have sex with, and then I can get a commitment from all of those individuals in different ways, therefore they haven't tied it to the issue of sex, which is central to the question of monogamy. The third point he makes is, well, look, the dominant social norm, just because it's a dominant social norm, doesn't mean it's coercion. Look, the fact of the matter is that we get most of our values from one place. It's called our parents. Our parents take the dominant social norms and teach them to us. When we're 5 years old and they show us pictures of, look, a happy family consisting of a mom, a pop, and 2 kids, we don't have the capacity to say, no, this isn't a particularly good idea. Rather, we're influenced not just by the norms that they teach us, but by the actions they take vis-a-vis us when it comes to whether or not they decide to give us an education, or whether they instead teach us ways to court members of the opposite sex instead of a formal education. He also says, well, look, people will use the fact of monogamy to take what they want and to take the people that they want in a way that monogamy prevents sort of one person with a lot of money to be able to simply take a lot of sexual partners. What we say on our side of the house is that when you actually weaken the monogamous norm, you have a situation in which people with money are less likely to be able to do that because people no longer feel a need to have a sense of support for one particular person. And finally, the thing I want to respond to is this point, well, it's good that you have someone who you'll have with you forever. We don't see, again, why monogamy is necessary to that. We have support systems which consist of all sorts of people who we do not sleep with and who nevertheless stay with us until they give us a sense of support. Insert when we're down and when we're elderly. First, what is gender emancipation out of this time? They say on their side of the house that, well, it's the presence of values that benefit women. And because monogamy is something that women often like, it therefore promotes the goal of gender emancipation. We say this is absolute nonsense. I'll take you a moment. Look, divorce courts often give custody of children to women because they believe that a child is better off with a woman. That benefits individual women in many cases, and yet that does not actually further the goal of gender emancipation because it perpetuates a norm that harms women, namely that it's a woman's job to raise the kids. And we think that when they say, oh look, someone would like commitment and monogamy, they do not prove that it actually furthers the goal of gender emancipation. Yes?
If all norms are inherently coercive, you can never make choices about them, why openly happy for heterosexuality to be a norm in your world?
Look, we don't defend the proposition that heterosexuality has to be the only way to go. For example, Canadian society has done a pretty good job incorporating homosexuality. The more, not just the monogamous social structures, but increasingly the more pluralistic social structures that they're beginning to encourage. And so furthermore, Mr. Speaker, to conclude this point about what is gender emancipation, we say it's the presence not just equality, but the acceptance of general sameness between men and women when it comes to their particular societal roles. We do not accept, as they tried to pin us with, the idea that all we want to do is to promote good child rearing. We define emancipation as being free from any norm that says that just because you have a particular biological function, you have to operate a certain way when it comes to who you decide to have sex with, when it comes to who you want to spend your life with. However, we say that when it comes to people who do see child rearing as particularly important, they are benefited in a world in which they are not stuck with having their partner being the only one where it is acceptable for them to raise that child. They can go to their school and say, look, I have multiple parents who are in charge of raising this child, whether or not I sleep with them, and that won't be frowned upon by the people at that school simply because it happens to violate a societal norm about the rightness of parenting, this ridiculous idea that the person I want to sleep with forever also has to be the person most responsible in raising my kid. The second point of crystallization I want to get to is, does having monogamy actually necessarily prevent gender emancipation? My partner has given you many reasons why this is actually the case. It is because monogamy is a social norm which necessarily causes judgment about what is appropriate and not appropriate in a particular relationship. It tells you what you need to do and that you have to do what your partner is incapable of doing. And my partner spoke to you earlier about how that burdens women because of biology, because the monogamous norm necessarily encourages people to say monogamy is about child rearing, monogamy is about making sure that the woman takes, not at this time, that the woman takes her role in making in reproductive areas. But also we think that things like sexism and homophobia are inherent in marriage. We think it's a complete fallacy that we've accepted. No, well, all we have to do is change our marriage laws to accept things like same-sex marriage, and we won't have a problem. The reason for that is because people will always assign particular roles which exclude others when it comes to the marital norm. Because once you establish that monogamy has a certain purpose, that purpose will necessarily disadvantage and prejudice those who don't agree with that purpose. Be it child rearing, be it having sex with the same person for life. That's the reason why systems of oppression are actually made worse by the presence of monogamy. Furthermore, my partner talked to you about how the requirement that you stay with one person actually creates a reluctance of divorce, because you feel as if there must be something wrong with you if you can't be happy in a relationship which your parents have taught you is the way it's supposed to go. That traps particularly women in unhappy marriages who know that even if they're able to break the psychological hold they have on getting divorced, that they won't be able to succeed in the marketplace in general because of discrimination against them and because they haven't been given the advantages by their parents that perhaps their brother got because they were seen as women incapable, or it's not necessary to give them that particular education. And finally, I wanted to talk to you about how the monogamous norm leads to the idea that a body is something that can be owned by a person for any period of time. We completely reject this particular idea. We think that any system which says, well, your body should be the sexual right of another person for any period of time, even if the person willingly consents, goes against the idea of sameness as emancipation. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for the address, and I invite the whip forward to close out the round.
At closing opposition, we did two things in this debate. The first thing was we asked whether the characterization of an autonomous social scene was actually one that people would derive benefit from. We asked the question of whether it was possible for this autonomous social scheme to escape the veil of the patriarchy. Because we said that there was no inherent value to making autonomous decisions unless they were furthering your actual interests. And what Michael told you was that even if there were potentially fewer taboos, that people would still be pressured by men with better bargaining position, more social and economic capital, to make autonomous decisions that actually didn't reflect their real interest in these cases. In other words, the effect of their policy was that it meant that relationships always and only happened on male terms in the vast majority of cases. But the second observation we made in this debate was we gave you a plausible characterization of how dominant norms could be a guide but might not be coercive. That they could say you were different without saying that you were a defective human being. We think that often norms exist for good reasons, because people are social animals. They like following other people. We think actually it guides people in what they do, because the human existence would be confusing without other people to indicate what's going on. We acknowledge in this debate that there is some trade-off here, right? That side has slightly more autonomy, probably, and this side has considerably more stability. But the difference in this debate is we can guarantee that through legal mechanisms and tangible things that people could hold individuals to account for when they mess up. Their side has no redress in those cases. And they just dismiss the nuclear option in this debate. The point about it is not that you have to use it in every case. You divorce the guy next the first time he doesn't wash the dishes. The point is that is a threat and you hold that against him. Whereas in polygamous relationships and the kind of informal interactions that you ratify, the problem is you have no method of doing that. It's unfalsifiable and there's also no legal reason. So the point in this debate was we can guarantee certain stability, we can guarantee certain continuity, whereas your side can only promise or kind of posit certain other values. It's not clear that those even then reflect the actual interests of the actors in the story. One thing, the compatibility of monogamy and marriage with gender emancipation. So this policy, not yet, presupposes a certain amount of political capital to challenge patriarchal norms. The question is whether the institution of marriage systematically obstructs that. Now, I think there are only two things that side says that are inherent features of marriage that they criticise. The first is closing opposition tell you that monogamy ties you to a relationship. That is undoubtedly true. That's also what monogamy is. So thank you for pointing that out. But the point about it is that relationships, unlike the human experience, is never perfect all the time. But it is a net positive to be in a relationship over a significant amount of time. Michael details those things. He said it provides a reliability, it cares for you in old age, it does all sorts of things which your informal hookups can never guarantee. The next thing they say is more interesting, when they say, but what this does is it creates a notion of ownership. But I think that's the most pessimistic possible reading of what marriage is. Because actually, the only way you can really build intimate bonds with someone is by knowing them to an extremely large degree. It's not about ownership, that's just about to really understand who someone is and to gain benefit for yourself as a person, right? And to improve your personal autonomy and your sexual autonomy, you really need to get to know that person. So it's not about ownership. Right? Those connotations have long since left marriage, and we don't think those are in any way inherent to marriage. So why does marriage then allow for a fuller and faster
Before
to
you go
critique
on.
of patriarchal institutions. The first thing to recognise here, and in fact this was completely missed by the Gov bench, was that it's never possible to completely solve patriarchy once and for all, forever, right? We can get very close, but the point is, to some extent, right, it is an iterative and continuous process, and we need tangible institutions to critique that. So the point that Michael tells you is one of the benefits of marriage, right, is that it has certain legal norms which are more verifiable and falsifiable. So in instances where things are going wrong, women can point to that and say, I want legal redress, I want a divorce, right? Your side doesn't have that, and it's much harder, right? It's definitionally true, right, that the patriarchy isn't that easy to see, and in many cases it's hard to point out. But at least our side can point to particular iterations and then hold them to account where it does happen. So we say that it has more tangibility, but also more accountability in those cases. Closing.
When you talk about ownership of individuals, it's society that places the onus of particular thing, that all the intimacy and all the values you have has to be funneled to that one individual. Whether or not you believe you're being owned by it, society believes that that person owns the right to your particular whatever thing you're valuing on that side of the house.
I don't think that's how people see marriage. People plow a lot into one person because they want enormous amounts out of a person, right? That's why people choose to spend their life. Like, the reason I probably do want to spend my life with somebody is not because I want to own them, it's because I really want to be with them. And I think a lot of people genuinely do feel that way. There's a real desire in the human breast to actually spend time with people, to invest something in them rather than constantly flitting between people, because ultimately you don't get that much out. So, the third key benefit of what marriage and monogamy announce, not yet, is in terms of legal redress. So this debate, to a large extent, does assume that the competent divorce laws exist, otherwise we wouldn't be anywhere near gender emancipation. And we do think this is taking place in jurisdictions where that is true. But what legal redress means is that if your mind changes, if circumstances change, that you do have increased independence as a woman. It means that not opening government, not yet, are naive to presume that parents can just encourage the independence of girls. Because as Michael tells you, that doesn't happen in a world without economic equality, because females would be harmed by that independence, because men have greater bargaining power, right? He tells you how that money can be used as leverage in certain relationships, right, in polygamous relationships. He also tells you how men are able to use the information that they have in polygamous relationships to exploit their position. Go on.
Oh, okay. So when women become more financially independent and have access to better divorce laws, divorce rates tend to skyrocket. As marriage and monogamy becomes less sexist, it just becomes less relevant. Be the first speaker on our bench to acknowledge and respond to this.
I'm happy for monogamy to exist, and marriage to exist, and divorce to exist. I don't think that is a tension, right? In some ways, right, acknowledging the problem, it's like the direct relief thing, right? Sometimes you just have to acknowledge certain problems with that institution and embrace them, right? And marriage can be made a stronger institution by saying, look, in some places it doesn't work out, but a lot of people do want it to work, and they sincerely think it will at the point where they get married in the first place. So I really don't think that that's a tension in this case. But the point is that Michael tells you in terms of this legal redress is that in polygamous relationships, men have far more power because they know where the individual women may have rivalries between them that undermine their ability to mobilize collectively. The point really here is that full gender emancipation is about realizing your sexuality. Most people ultimately do want that to happen in a world with monogamous relationships, and we think that the best way to reflect that is to recognise that. For these reasons, we approach.
I thank you all for the excellent debate. I invite you to come forward, shake hands, and then leave and not come back.